Hi, everyone. Good morning. Thank you very much for joining us at the Ofgem Strategic Innovation Fund Ideation Program. So I'm Masao Ashteen. I'm a Senior Manager at the Carbon Trust. Probably first note of housekeeping is if you've just joined, please go on mute as soon as you can. I'm hearing some lovely bird chirping in the back, but until we get to the Q&A, we would like if you keep muted, feel free to keep your camera off until the Q&A, and we'll remind you when you can be able to come on and engage with us then. But we're getting started. We're just going to wait a minute just to let some people filter in. We have a lot of activity in the attendee lists already. So we will start fairly shortly. I think we have a healthy amount of attendees already, so let's just kick it off. So again, good morning. Thank you everyone for joining. If you didn't hear the earlier bit, I'm Masao Ashteen. I'm the Senior Manager at the Carbon Trust, and we're working with the SIF team to run the ideation process, which is basically how do we refine a lot of the ideas needed in innovation space in the UK's energy system. And we all know we have a lot of ideas there, a lot of challenges, a lot of problems as we get to clean power, as we get to net zero 2050. So the first one that we're bringing to you today is our opening webinar, is how can we address the rise of large energy, also known as high energy, throughout the webinar, demand on the grid. So what we're going to be doing is running you through a bit about what is SIF, if you're unfamiliar, because we're very keen on bringing in a lot of people who are outside of the energy space to make sure that we crash those echo chambers a bit and engage a bit more cross-sector. And then we're going to be looking at the challenge theme in particular. So when we're talking about high energy. Again, for anyone just joining, please mute yourself on entry. That would be most appreciated. After that, we will have our expert panel just run through some of the challenges from their perspective. We have Simon Orr, we have Sarah Hayes, and we have Jason Payne, and they're going to be sharing some of their experiences where this challenge is concerned and what they would like to see from an innovation perspective and some of the problems where they see some key areas of focus needed. We'll then open it up the floor to the Q&A. That's the fun part. We'll have 10 minutes at the end. We're not going to spend too long in Q&A. There's a lot of opportunity afterwards to engage with the SIF team. This is just one of other webinars and workshops, so don't worry. This is not the be-all, end-all. It's just the start. And then we will then get into some SIF ideation problem statement activities. Again, just introducing you to what you would have seen in the pre-read and the email before this webinar, where we're looking primarily at what are some specific problem statements from your perspective that people should be involved with. So next slide, please. So as I mentioned, you can start from now. We're going to have the webinar run, but in the background, as you're hearing some of these challenges, as you're hearing some problems, hopefully that gets the wheels spinning in the mind and you're going, that's a great problem that we should be tackling. We would love for you to chuck that into Slido for us. So there's a QR code on the screen there. You can also use the code below. And basically all you're doing within this is entering a problem statement. But before entering that problem statement, what would be really good to avoid duplication of effort and wasting your time is to have a look and see what's already been entered, because you may find your idea already there. And then you can upvote, and then we will take those ideas into workshops where we further refine them, as well as work with those ideas throughout the whole ideation period to ensure that we really get points of focus. Now, what we're trying to do here is not lock in ideas. We're not seeing any idea that has not been presented through these webinars and workshops that you can't get involved in the SIF process. That is not the case at all. What we're simply trying to do is identify really key pain points that keep coming up over and over to really sort of focus people, coalesce people around the same problem area, and bring groups together that probably have a lot of interest within these areas to then be able to funnel into the SIF application process, whether it be discovery or alpha or even beta. So Like I said, within Slido, you can also upvote. You can see what problems have been listed there, and we can have a look at those towards the end of the webinar. We'll bring that back up. Now, please note that the Slido's been a bit naughty and says on the slide, audience Q&A. It is not the Q&A session. Please just keep that in mind. We've presented this in some of the emails to when we sent this out as well. This is the problem statement section. The Q&A will be separate, and we'll be using the Q&A panel option within this Teams to be capturing your questions on the webinar. So these are not questions for speakers. If you place your questions for speakers on Slido, they will be lost. So please just use the Q&A function within the chat for that. So we'll get back to this in a bit more detail, and we'll give you guidance on what a problem statement looks like, or a good problem statement. So we'll come back to this a bit later on. But without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Joe Davidson, who is from the SIF team, to just run you through a little bit more about SIF. And Joe is the Energy Systems Innovation Lead there. And we're specifically discussing some of the round 5 challenges and why you're here in the first place. So over to you, Joe. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks very much, Masao. So as mentioned, I'm Joe Davidson, one of the Energy Systems Innovation Leads at Innovate UK, working on the Ofgem Strategic Innovation Fund. And I'll give a brief overview of the fund in a bit more detail, and also then the specific round 5 challenges that we most recently launched and are here today to discuss in a bit more detail. So firstly, what is the Strategic Innovation Fund? It's a major investment programme looking to drive energy network innovation, and it's paid for by consumers on their energy bills. There's £450 million available across the period of 2021 to 2026, and it's designed to help energy network users and consumers. It's at time of launch, a new innovation competition process, more of which I'll get onto in a bit in terms of how we frame projects and move them through the SIF process. But on screen, you can see a few of the highlights from the programme to date. So we've funded over 240 projects, more of which on how you can learn about that portfolio towards the end of the presentation, and some key resources on those. We've allocated over £230 million of that 450 million. That's garnered across those projects over £40 million in additional contributions from partners, and approximately 300 different organisations have received funding through those portfolio of projects mentioned, and over 100 SMEs have received additional support. On the left, you can see some early indication of benefits from the portfolio projects, as some key flavour of what we're looking to realise across cost savings and also emissions reductions by 2035. Next slide, please. A bit more on the strategic aspects of the SIF. So in terms of vision, we're looking to accelerate the UK's transition to net zero at lowest cost to the consumer, and also make the UK the best country for energy businesses to grow and scale. And that's part of what this ideation process is about, is bringing new third parties together with energy networks around problems that SIF can address through our challenges. In terms of mission, we've got 3 key areas that we're looking to help people, help the planet, and help businesses. And a bit more on that as I move through the slides. Next slide, please. In terms of then how we deliver that, the 6 key areas you see on the slide here of what we're focusing on and how we're achieving that. I mentioned our innovation process. So on the right-hand side, you can see how we run that. We launch annual innovation challenges. Then we have projects coalesce around a discovery, alpha, beta model. So discovery projects receive up to £150,000 of SIF funding for feasibility study projects, up to 5 months in length. Some of those projects then move into alpha, so £500,000 of SIF funding, up to 8 months in project length for proof of concept. And then we have our beta projects, so multi-year, multi-million-pound demonstrators, of which we now have over 20 in the portfolio. And these are in the range of £10 million of SIF funding being allocated for those multi-year demonstrators. And that allows us to be responsive and shift in line with both the challenge setting process to ensure we remain strategic and in line with wider policy and energy network initiatives. But also, as we move through discovery, alpha, beta, we can extract learnings and continue funding the most transformational projects. Not all projects move through discovery, alpha, and beta, so a really key part of the SIF is in evidence and insights, both from projects that don't continue to the next phase, as well as our live portfolio. so extracting and communicating that evidence and insight to key stakeholders. Diversifying the pipeline, so we start with a large portfolio of discoveries and narrow down and look at different ways of tackling challenges from different perspectives. We look to align across the ecosystem, both on an Innovate UK part, across wider Innovate UK programmes and UK research and innovation programmes, but also with the wider energy network landscape. And commercialisation support. So we have a dedicated commercial function within the team and look to provide support to SMEs and new third parties to help engage with the SIF and bring to new products, initiatives and services to help revolutionise and transform the energy network space. Next slide, please. That then brings me on to our most recently launched Round 5 challenges. So at the end of March of this year, we launched our Round 5 challenges, of which there is 7, and that's a bit of a deviation from our previous rounds, more of which I'll get onto in a second. But we have the 7 challenges you see on the screen. Number 1, advanced energy transmission and networks, looking at semiconductors, superconductor and wireless power transmission applications to the grid. Challenge 2 is on dynamic modelling, so looking at advanced grid simulation and optimization. Challenge 3, of which we're here to focus on, we have a great panel of speakers to talk in more detail about. That's looking at scalable approaches to integrate the rise of large energy demands, of which data centers is one, but in scope is other high energy demand points. Challenge 4 is on consumer-centric grid expansion, looking at novel technology and processes to deliver grid expansion that enhances public support and also delivers wider benefits. Challenge 5 is on enhanced system visibility and control, looking at improved digital automation and enhanced system monitoring. Challenge 6 is on green gas, looking at, for instance, biomethane and bio-SNG and integrating them in cost-effective ways. And then finally, Challenge 7 is on whole system optimization, so looking at enabling gas and multi-vector decarbonisation through whole system approaches. Next slide, please. I mentioned with Round 5 that it was a bit of a deviation from how we've previously run the challenge setting. So we, from rounds 1 to 4, we announced in the spring of each of those years 4 innovation challenges. This year we have announced 7, and importantly, these are open until the end of 2026. So historically, these have been refreshed on an annual basis, but these Round 5 challenges are in scope until the end of 2026 for proposal development and applications. As you can see, from Round 1 to Round 5, we've got some principles that have guided us in that challenge setting across those years. So we've looked to make challenges more specific and mission orientated, be agile and respond to system and societal needs, assess the key gaps in the portfolio and where there's room for exploiting further SIF projects, bring to the fore more cross-cutting topics, more of which I'll get onto in a second, and also ensure we remain consistent and continuously review net zero policy and regulatory direction. You can see that we've got beta projects live in round 1 and 2. I mentioned we've got over 20 in the portfolio, more of which on how you can engage with those in a later slide. We've got our alpha portfolio that's currently in round 3, and then we've got discovery projects in round 4, with then round 5 being open for applications, as I mentioned, until the end of 2026 to allow for greater market alignment and strategic direction to help develop high quality transformational proposals around those 7 challenges. Next slide, please. I also mentioned we have cross-cutting considerations, and there's 7 of these that are embedded within the challenge document for round 5. You can see these on the slide, and these are considerations that all projects looking to submit under round 5 should be considering when developing ideas and potential applications to submit into the SIF. So we've got customer focused, bearing in mind that the SIF is funded via customer energy bills, just ensuring that clear benefit and customer focus in projects. Skills and capability, supply chains, data and digitalization, scalability and replicability, shared learning and resilience. I'll touch upon the shared learning in a bit more detail, in that not all projects will lead to deployment, but it's really key of being able to disseminate and share learning from projects. And that's a big focus of the portfolio projects we've got and our funding. of how can others looking to engage in the energy network space build upon and leverage insights from what's gone before to help further innovation and development of new products and services. Next slide, please. I think I'm handing over to Masao.
Yes, thank you, Joe. Just to run over again some housekeeping for all of those who may have entered. Just remember, Slido is not for questions for the Q&A. Please use the Q&A panel here. So we'll remove any questions that come in for speakers or anything else from the Slido. Remember, Slido is, we're largely going to be using that for the problem statement. I know it's a bit confusing with the slide saying audience Q&A. Please ignore that. Also, if you're entering the chat and staying within it, which I hope you do, please stay muted. Thank you very much, guys. So let's move on to the challenge area in a little bit more detail. This has all been spelled out in the Round 5 document published by the SIF team and Ofgem. So we're focusing particularly on high energy demand, and the particular sentence that has been pulled out there verbatim is how can we develop scalable approaches to integrate the rise of large demands. So if we're looking at data centers or other sort of industrial clusters, ensuring increasing capacity within the next decade. So next slide, please. So this is around a few problems within this challenge. We all know that there's a meteoric rise of AI, generative AI. I mean, AI has been around for a very long time as a technology. But when we're looking at data centers being used to sort of fuel our immense amount of digitalization across the energy sector and many other sectors, there's a huge role. And that's why we've had data centers more of a focus here. But it's not exclusive to just data centers. We're talking about anything that presents a really high energy point on the grid, anything that may be able to lock out other capacity because of the queuing issues or planning issues. We're looking at the sort of geospatial implications of where they should be placed. How do we sort of forecast that growth? How do we future-proof that growth on the grid as well? And any sort of these developments that are really key for the economic growth, we would want to make sure that the UK's energy system really remains at the forefront, particularly as we go through this rapid change and expansion on our route to net zero. So there are a few key things that this challenge is meant to present. 3 of them listed out on the left, and then we try to talk about why is this really important now when we're looking at the SIF Round 5. So we have a lot of local, regional, and national complexities when we're looking at high energy demand points, and that varies very much depending on the technology. If it's data centers and how data centers actually connect, their water usage, how energy efficient they are, can they be flexible, for example, or we're looking at any sort of industrial decarbonisation activities or hydrogen clusters or anything else that's on the point of the grid connection where we either don't have enough capacity, we will not have enough capacity, or the planning just does not allow for proper integration. That's where we really want the sweet spot for innovation here. Now, I've already seen some questions come through about how did that differentiate with NESO, and we can tackle that in the Q&A. That's not a problem at all. That's a great question. So when we're looking at the traditional planning for grids, and we're looking at the sort of high density integration of these technologies, the innovation that we're looking for and the ideation in this process is what are some key problems that we'll be seeing. We, again, like I mentioned at the start, we're very keen to get people who are outside of the energy sector or in other utilities to be able to come in and say, look, this is the problem that we may have faced in our either commercial or utility setups, and this is how we can implement some similar systems and processes to overcome what we're facing in the energy sector. So it's all about how we reduce the bottlenecks. We definitely don't want any stranded assets or capacity. We don't want things taking so long by the time one plan has been put in place is now obsolete, or it definitely doesn't have the fit for purpose in the future because of delays that we're facing, or either there's an imbalance in terms of how these things are connected. It is not providing an equitable connection, or some are becoming too connected faster than others. We've seen that in the past with some data centers with deeming as a priority or critical infrastructure, and then other sort of assets can take a bit longer to get connected. And we know there's a lot going on in the planning space. And again, we can touch on some of these issues in the Q&A and how this differentiates with what we're looking at in the Round 5. But it's all about how do we apply those challenges and the cross-sector sort of themes that Joe presented in the previous few slides to really scale capacity up in the next decade. grid? How do we find better tools and systems for understanding where we'll be going with some of these connection points for high energy systems? Again, using data centers as an example, what are the forecasting tools that we can use, geospatial or otherwise? And then how can we better understand the operation of these systems, either to provide more flexibility, energy efficiency, to allow for smoother integration? Next slide, please. So before we get into some of the points for the speakers, sorry, keep these things in mind. And again, if you're using the Slido code that you would have seen before, again, if you've joined late, don't worry, we're going to bring that back up with the code. But if you're already on Slido, have a think about these issues while you're trying to generate some problem statements. There are already some in there already, so have a look and see how you can add to them and give some additionality there. But we're looking at some of the challenges presented in blue at the top, which is we have that surging high demand from emerging sectors, and they're across a few different sectors. And we are having demand really probably outpacing the ability to connect. We all know that's a big issue. If you're looking at the second one, the grid connection process is certainly under pressure. We had a few reports on this nationally. So we're looking at how the infrastructure and capacity constraints limited in flexibility, they're limited in the adoption of LCTs or the advanced efficiency technologies, our ability to shift the peaks. And again, if we're looking data centers as an example, that you can't easily just turn a data center off or reduce the amount of energy being used at times. So this is really key in innovation to understand how these really advanced pieces of kit coming on to the grid. And when I say kit, that is definitely understatement when we're talking about hyperscale data centers, how we can make them more efficient and implement them a bit better. And then how do we give them the strategic access to allow for that growth, not allowing stifling, getting the grid up to capacity where digitalization is concerned to be able to do even further. Because a lot of these high energy demand points are really enabling technologies to allow us to do further growth in the energy network and across many other sectors. So if we get this wrong, we're going to have a lot of knock-on effects in many other sectors. So for this ideation round, and as well for the activities that we're concerned with the problem setting and the future workshop that we're looking really at the three key ones here. Two have been highlighted in the box there, where we're looking at how to reduce the stranded capacity risk. So that's around forecasting, planning, and anticipate capacity for high energy demand centers. We also want to understand how to reduce peak demand and optimize network capacity. So whether that be through the implementation of flexible demand management, real-time coordination, and coordination particularly across other sectors, because we can't just work in silos and assume that this high demand energy is going to have to coordinate in a vacuum. But also we're quite interested in understanding how we innovate the space with grid connection process. And it's not necessarily about the process of planning and how that's approved in the queue necessarily. We're looking at how you can make systems much better to be implemented where they become less issues for planning, where they become less issues around delays and fair access, etc. And remember, the consumer is always at the heart of this. The Innovation Fund provides a lot of money to be able to understand and tackle these problems in a strategic manner, but it's coming from the consumer really primarily at heart in terms of focus and making sure that we sort of bring those benefits directly back to the consumer in the long run. So with the next slide, I'm going to go back to Simon. Sorry, not Simon, Joe, who is going to run us through some of the previous projects or projects that are currently in the SIF portfolio that are tackling some of these issues, just to give you an idea of what's out there. And again, avoid any duplication of efforts, but see how we can bring some additionality in this space. Over to you, Joe.
Thanks, Masara. So yeah, as mentioned, we have looked to, on this slide, give a flavour of what's in the SIF portfolio currently to support sort of building upon and leveraging insights from those projects and understand where the SIF's focused effort and what is in our portfolio currently. So you'll see on the slide a couple of projects called out, but I'd like to also highlight that as a fund, we now also publish 3 times a year an annual project directory with an up-to-date list of all the projects that we funded all the way back to round 1 that was shown in 2021 on the slide earlier, to get a comprehensive view of what the SIF has funded across all of our challenges, all of our themes, You can see details of who's involved in those projects and where they're at in terms of the discovery alpha beta phases and the funding awards. There's links to those at the end of the deck, which we'll be sharing. There's also additional material in the deck that's going to be circulated on further case studies, both across the UK, other initiatives, connections reform, for instance, activity has been mentioned in the Q&A already. So links and materials for those and what's going on in that space, but also international case studies that we've looked to highlight and support understanding in consideration for this challenge. I suppose one of the things from the case studies pulled out here is to think about that point of this is not just data centres that is in scope for this challenge. We've got projects considering maritime port decarbonisation, rural industries decarbonisation plans. We've got distributed data centres as part of SHIELD. We've also got artificial forecasting, which is in beta, looking at improved load forecasting capabilities. From this, we've looked to try and sort of narrow the scope of this webinar and also the ideation workshop that we'll be having at All Energy around the first two themes under the specific challenge, and the connections third theme as a sort of a lower priority focus around the ideation activities here, based on some of the activity going on around the landscape and looking to resolve some of the challenges there. In terms of some of the key gap areas, Misal mentioned a couple of these, but some of that cross-sector forecasting and planning, more tailored flexibility models, considerations for integration of on-site load management, and also multi-utility infrastructure planning tools are some of the key areas we've looked to when looking at portfolio thought of gap areas. But as mentioned, we want to hear from the audience. So we have that slider open for problem statements where you think effort should be focused. And that's really encouraged that if you see areas of scope or interest within the challenge that need resolving, to let us know about those. And this is a high-level gap analysis. There's further information and details that are going to be sent as follow-up from this webinar. So we encourage you to engage with those resources as well to understand both across the UK, but also internationally, some perspectives. And you'll hear some of those from the speakers that we have as part of our expert panel, which neatly segues me into our first expert speaker, which we have Simon from National Grid Electricity Transmission, and who is their Head of Strategy and Innovation. So I'll hand over to Simon.
Thanks, Joseph. Hi, everyone. I think I've already been introduced in my role. I'll just talk a little bit about who I am quickly. I'm aware I've only got 15 minutes to talk about this very interesting, very rich topic. So I'll try and keep the pace up. So I have been working in National Grid electricity transmission for almost 15 years. I've spent about half of that time working as a power system engineer and about half of that time working in strategy and innovation. And I've kind of got a strategy and an innovation hat, which makes both my hats kind of very interested in this topic. So obviously, you know, the team that works with SIF projects and runs SIF projects in National Grid works for me, as do the kind of engineering strategy teams that think about problems like the one that we're wrestling with today, about how do we connect these large kind of strategic demands to the network and do so in the most optimal way for the whole system. So of double interest to me. Can I have the next slide, please? So the first thing I want to do is just come up a level to really focus on something that kind of the earlier context work Massoud kind of mentioned as well, which is this challenge, although significant and really important to the country, really important to the energy industry, is not the only thing going on right now. You know, it would be a significant challenge if this were happening kind of 20 years ago in its right, and it would be the one big thing that would be consuming the kind of industry's interests. But now, the level of change and transformation we're seeing in the energy industry and the electricity industry, it's just sort of one big transformational driver among many. And this slide is just kind of reminding us all something that I'm sure everyone who's involved in the energy industry and the electricity industry is aware of, but I'll link it in a minute, is that we've got this enormous transformation. And from National Grid Electricity Transmission's perspective, we've got this enormous volume of work being driven by a revolution on the generation and storage side, moving to renewable net zero generation sources, enormous, as you can see there, maybe between 5 to 10 growth in the storage capacity we have on the network, big increase in interconnector connections and flows across the network as well. And we're having to build multiple times more onshore and offshore transmission in order to connect all these energy system users and to be able to create the capacity for electricity to flow around the network, especially electricity flowing from Scotland down to all the way down to the south of England and everywhere in between, from the East Coast and everything that's going on in the North Sea. So there's an enormous amount of work going on, and that's really important for a couple of reasons. One, it means this problem is coming in as we're, experiencing lots of other constraints and challenges. But two, it means, as I'll bring this point out later, more specifically, we need to make sure that we are not optimizing against this challenge in isolation from everything else that's going on in the electricity industry, everything else that's happening to the transmission system and the energy system more widely. And I'll kind of talk about some of the stuff that we're already doing that in a minute. Could we have the next slide, please? So first of all, I wanted to give a breakdown of what does this particular challenge about these strategic high point demands, connecting these demands, what does this particular challenge mean for national grid electricity transmission? What does it mean for the transmission system specifically? And I've kind of broken this down into a where and when, a how do we connect these demands to the system? And some of these things are, I think, relatively straightforward. Some of them are maybe a bit counterintuitive to some of the narrative that goes around this topic. So I just wanted to break this down. And then in the second, the next thing I'll talk about is what national grid electricity transmission are already doing, or what we're already starting, or already trying to do to tackle some of these specific challenges or these elements of the challenges. So the first of all, in the challenge of thinking about where are we going to connect these high point demands, such as data centers, hydrogen electrolysis, other major industrial load sources, the volume of contracted capacity that we already have applied for connections to the transmission system far exceeds any kind of credible kind of near to medium term industry growth projection. When you're talking about emerging industries like data center AI growth, it's very difficult to say kind of credibly what things are going to look like in decades time. But when you're talking about the kind of 5 to 10 year time window, we've got an enormous amount of connection applications and offers already, and we know that that's a lot more than will actually kind of be built and need to be connected in the next 5 to 10 years. The second thing is to say that although there's an enormous amount of kind of narrative around locational clustering of these kind of connections and these point demands, and kind of understandably so, actually, what we see from all the applications that we have is that actually the applications are spread all over England and Wales across an enormous number of sites. And actually, the density and the kind of clustering of these connection applications is not necessarily at all what you kind of necessarily expect. Now, there's interesting questions there, which I think is absolutely a really fascinating area that more work needs to be done, is to say, well, is that lack of clustering to do with where this demand really wants to be, or is it the lack of clustering to do with actually what capacity is available? So, and this is an interesting question when you're talking about the where of these demands. There's a big tension between, well, the demand maybe wants to be in these certain locations that are best for their specific industries, but actually, now that electricity capacity is one of the really major driving forces of whether you can get a major demand project built, or when you can get it built, or how expensively you can get it built. How much is the location going to be driven by network availability rather than the network being driven by where the demand most wants to be, kind of irrespective of network constraints and network costs and these considerations? And I think there's a lot of uncertainty as to which of these not necessarily which will win out, but what will the balance be between these two, the natural locational drivers, irrespective of network and energy system, and the energy system locational drivers. And there's discussions about, as you can see, the last point in this where thing about strategic planning. How much strategic planning will there be of demand? We're already, with connection reform, entering a world of beginning the conversation, beginning the process of strategic planning around generation and storage. But we're not there yet on demand. There's conversations, there's consultations, but no kind of firm decisions, and certainly nothing binding behind those decisions as well. And there's an interesting question of how binding will this kind of strategic planning process be in the energy industry, which again kind of creates uncertainty. Now, that isn't to say that the conversation about strategic planning is bad or negative. It just creates another factor that we need to think about when we're trying to work out where are we gonna be connecting these big demand loads. So that's the kind of challenge of the where. It's not just a matter of is it this region or that region. It's to do with the spread. It's to do with the degree of clustering. It's the will we see natural demand need roll out, or will we actually, as an energy industry, be directing where these things go? Secondly, there's a big challenge about when we connect these things. Now, I don't know if it's surprising to you to know, probably if you've been involved in developing connection projects before, or you've been involved on the utility side, you won't be surprised to know that all customers want connections as soon as possible. Not many really ask for connections along, even a medium term in the future. They'd rather have a connection in 3 years than a connection in 5, 7, 10. There's an interesting question over whether that's always kind of credible anyway. If we could offer them a quick connection, could they turn it around? But they would much rather have the option of a quick connection, that's for sure, right? Even if they can't connect that quickly in the end themselves, they would like it as an option. And all these customers want connections right now in that context that I showed on the last slide, which is we're already ramping up to do an enormous work of connecting generators, connecting storage, and building network capacity in order to get that generation and storage from where it is to where it needs to be in the next from now all the way up to the next 10 years ahead. So that is a big challenge, because obviously it's not just about we need to ramp up these connections to do much more directly connected demands than we've done in the past, but we need to do it in the context that everything else and all the other work volumes that we've got are ramping up as well. And obviously there are constraints around things like supply chain and workforce and manufacturing capacity and all those things, and network access. We have to manage and optimize all these things, and so therefore it is not straightforward to offer connection dates as early as customers would like to have the option to. Secondly, and this is kind of what I touched on about strategic planning and connection reform. Connection reform, if you're not aware, is coming in and essentially saying that in our connection queue for generation and storage, we will have these kind of volumes that are set on a kind of need basis, based around national or regional targets. So, for example, we will have a certain amount of offshore wind needed for 2030 in energy scenarios, and based on analysis that's been done around government targets for 2030, we'll have an amount of storage in different parts of the country, solar, etc., connected to distribution networks, connected to transmission networks, and this should bring in realistic volumes of generation and storage connection activity to kind of give us a greater level of certainty as networks where we need to build capacity and by when and how much. And that's enormously helpful on the generation storage side. We're not necessarily going to get that same clarity through this process that we're doing in 2025 for demand connections. Now, there's a very good reason for that. First of all, I don't think it was necessarily the challenge that connection reform was designed to solve. But secondly, the energy system and the players like ourselves and NESO and others can make some really informed takes and positions about, well, if you want to reach a certain objective of decarbonisation, this is a credible pathway, these are credible volumes, and based on what we know about connection projects and the network, these are credible places where these volumes should go. For something like data centers, for example, the demand for data centers has got nothing to do with the energy system in itself and energy system demand. Therefore, we're not in a strong position. And I would also say the level of uncertainty and the level of divergence in what different people and different players think that demand's going to look like is great. That it will be a real challenge to come up with that kind of level of certainty. However, I will go on the next slide of saying, well, we are starting to trying and trying to think about that, and we are very keen to work with others to do that. Sorry, I was teasing the next slide. If we could just go back one slide quickly, and then lastly, I'll come on to the how. So the way that the connection activity is working, and this is not unsurprising as to how connections generally work, is that most connections are sort of bilateral in the sense of one connectee connecting to the network through predominantly sole use infrastructure, although we are having to build a lot of shared use infrastructure I'll get onto in a minute for some connections. But broadly speaking, one customer developing their demand project, they want to connect to the transmission system. We're going to connect them by building new infrastructure. They're going to build new infrastructure, and it's all going to be sole use for that one customer. Now, that obviously means that that's kind of different to how the customers of the distribution network, which all kind of share various bits of the distribution network. And that means that we need a really large volume of transmission equipment for a given amount of demand, because essentially we're having to not just create enough capacity for that individual customer, but we have to create enough redundant capacity. We have to create enough redundant capacity for that individual customer and all of these customers in isolation, which means that we have to build a lot of equipment. And again, that's in the context of we're needing to order and build a huge amount of equipment for all those other reasons that I've already mentioned as well. So that's an extra challenge. And lastly, in some places, the inverse is true, and that's still a big challenge. We have to because we've got such a density of new connections in the area, we have to build a brand new transmission substation in order to create enough capacity or enough connection points for customers. And there are long lead times potentially for building new substations. There traditionally have been, and that's a challenge. So the last couple of minutes, I'll just get on to what are we doing already, or what have we begun doing, or what are we thinking about these kind of initiatives I'm going through. I've got 6 things here quickly. They're not all at the same levels of maturity, but what we're doing. So my team, we have begun visualizing demand connections geospatially to look for these optimization opportunities, to measure and think about levels of clustering, to look at connection applications that have come in the past and new ones in the context that we can start really trying to think about how do we optimize, what are the best solutions here, how do we credibly meet different volumes of need in different areas, which is not necessarily the approach we've kind of taken before. There's always a risk that when the connection process drives you to make these kind of individual decisions about individual connectees, and there are reasons for that, but we're looking at trying to add this layer of kind of visualization optimization. And as well as that, we're trying to use market analysis and customer intelligence to help us better understand, like, really what is the data center demand in this part of the country, what's driving it, when will it be required, because frankly, we can't and shouldn't build the connection capacity that everyone is asking for all the time in comparison, because it's far too much. It's not all going to happen. And as Masao was talking about, we need to kind of manage that stranding risk. About the when, we're doing a couple of things to try and speed up connections. We're running an external review of our connection process to look for opportunities to speed up the process side of things. But at the same time, we're undertaking our own review to understand the whole end-to-end process from, initial customer conversation all the way through to, we have built new infrastructure and it's buzzing for the customer and they're connected. How do we speed up that whole process end to end? And a lot of that is to do with construction and engineering and development rather than just the process between us and the customer. And lastly, on the how, we're at the ideation stage of thinking about innovative ways to connect these large point loads in terms of what does the configuration look like, what equipment are we using, what level of resilience are we designing to, and we're also combining the analysis of our wider, electrification of heat, electrification of transport. How is this driving up diffuse demand in a given area, combined with these point loads? And we've brought them both into the same kind of innovative design and demand analysis tool. And we're using this tool in my team to look at what's the whole system optimization. How do we meet the demand for data centers, electrolysis, heat, transport, all in the same area in a whole system optimized way, rather than just thinking about one point. Ooh, that's everything that I have to say. But yeah, look forward to any kind of questions or follow-ups that we have, and I'll hand back to Marcel.
Thank you so much, Simon. Really good to see what National Grid is doing in this space. You give us a lot of food for thought there, and I know we're going to get some more food for thought from Sarah. So we're going to hear from Sarah, who's an independent consultant looking at data sharing infrastructure and what role that might play in the innovation space. So quickly over to you, Sarah.
Thank you, and hello everyone. So I've been involved in SIF for a while now. I chaired the Data and Digitalisation Expert Panel for the first few years, and I'm currently involved in a SIF project which is at beta phase at the moment. So unsurprisingly, I want to approach this challenge from the perspective of data sharing, and to sort of share my thoughts there on how, when you approach a SIF project, you need to be thinking about how you are going to manage and share data in your SIF project. So next slide, please. And if you look at all the ideas that are coming up on Slido today, and some really excellent ideas coming out there, all of those ideas are going to have to work with data. None of them will work without data. And then there is a question about how those ideas hopefully will become projects, how those projects will be able to access the data that they need to make the project successful. And whilst open data is a fantastic thing and should be used wherever possible, a lot of the data that you're likely to be working with won't be open. So you'll need to be thinking about how you're accessing and sharing data. So the key point I really want to make throughout my presentation is how secure data sharing underpins innovation. I really think it's impossible to do good innovation without thinking about how you are sharing data. So there are three areas that I would like to cover today. The first is on data sharing infrastructure and how that is an enabler for the sharing of data and what you need to be thinking about there. The second is around how you can share data in a way that can minimize energy use. And then the third area is around using data to minimize energy demand. So if we go on to the next slide, please. So in the guidance that's set out for SIF projects, and Joe mentioned this earlier, he talked about the cross-cutting considerations. So one of those cross-cutting considerations is data and digitalisation, and SIF projects are asked to, I'm just going to read it back to you again, they're asked to harness digitalisation and to implement energy data best practice across all areas. So I've put in front of you here those Ofgem's data best practice principles, which from a data sharing perspective are an excellent set of principles. And of course, energy networks have an obligation to adhere to those principles. But in practice, it is quite difficult to adhere to the letter of these principles at present without data sharing infrastructure in its fully fledged form. Now, NESO are developing data sharing infrastructure, so they will be the source of all information and all contact for data sharing infrastructure. But I just want you to make you aware of this point, that you need to be thinking about the data best practice principles and the data sharing infrastructure that's in development. So for example, if you look at principle number 8, which says ensure that data assets are interoperable with data assets from other data and digital services. That's a brilliant aspiration, but really to achieve it means that we need data sharing infrastructure enabling the safe, secure and seamless sharing of data within the energy system. but also with other sectors as well, because of course when we're thinking about optimizing the energy system, we have to think about the adjacent sectors across the economy. So that's what I just want to bring your attention to first of all, is Ofgem's data best practice principles. Please follow them as much as you can, and of course they are it's a regulatory obligation. On to the next slide. And data sharing infrastructure, as I've mentioned, this is being the development of data sharing infrastructure is being led by NESO. So certainly I would refer you to the NESO teams for further information and hopefully to collaborate with them in the future, and to the NESO website for information around the development of data sharing infrastructure. They're in the phase at the moment of developing a minimum viable product for data sharing infrastructure. So please do go and have a look at the information they have on that and talk to them about that. But here I just want to give you a high level idea of what data sharing infrastructure is seeking to do. And there are three key elements here to data sharing infrastructure: trust, prepare, and share. So trust is all about looking at the governance and the legal arrangements so that organizations and people are willing to share data. So you've got the right data license in place and you've got the right trust amongst parties, being a particularly important point. How do you get that trust in the first place so that people will be able to share data in a safe and secure way? The next area here is around data preparation and data standardization. So is it in the correct format, the right structure for sharing data? Have you adhered to the right standards, the right data standards, to be able to ensure that that data is ready for sharing with other organizations? And then there's the actual sharing of data. How are you going to transmit that data to another organization and actually share the data in practice? So those are the sort of the three that's sort of the simplest way to describe data sharing infrastructure, I think. But it's having in your mind there is a big national effort here to look at how we can develop data sharing infrastructure to ensure that it is secure and seamless, and thinking about how can whatever you're doing in your SIF project be a part of that data sharing infrastructure. And if you think about it, any of the projects that you will be working on form a potential use case for data sharing infrastructure. So you may well want to talk to NESO about that. So on to the next slide, please. So now I want to talk about sharing data to minimize energy use. So onto the next slide. How you actually share the data in your project will impact the amount of energy that you are using. So this is all about data sharing architectures, and there are different ways that we can share data in our projects. So when you're entering your project and you're thinking about how do I get data from different parties, as we do right now, you might be thinking, well, I can email a spreadsheet from one organisation to another. And if you think about that, we do a lot of that at the moment. We email things, we email files. If you think about that, as we use data, that the number of emails, the number of files is only going to increase over time, and it's a fairly inefficient way of sharing data and a fairly energy intensive way of sharing data. If we move on to the next slide, please. An alternative way is we could put all our data for the project into a central database, and that database could be open or it could be closed. But the problem there is that we need to manage that database, so we need to maintain it over time. And what if I'm putting lots of copies of one really important piece of data in lots of different central databases, because everyone's asking me for a copy of that data? It's secure data, so I've given them the right permissions to access that data, but I know that people have got a copy of that data in all sorts of different places, and that's been hosted in all sorts of different data centers. Think of the energy use that is associated with that. So onto the next slide, please. the alternative approach here is to look at the development of a distributed architecture. So instead of the data being held in different central databases all over the place, we think of the data being held at source, perhaps on the energy network system, and then parties being able to access managed copies of that data. But it's the actual data is held at source or at the energy networks on their system. And you can think about how you might be able to access temporary copies of that data. And with the distributed architecture, you've got to make sure there that you've got the right access, security and quality controls in place, and that's part of the development of data sharing infrastructure. So there is a move from centralized data sharing architectures to distributed architectures. Onto the next slide, please. In reality, what we're seeing is a mix of the three, because people like to email. That's what we've been doing traditionally. We've set up central databases, and there is a place for central databases. Sometimes data needs to be ring-fenced in a certain area, so there is a role for central databases, but not for all data. So the point I would like to make here is that the use of distributed architectures will minimize energy use. Onto the next slide. And to me, that makes intuitive sense, because I think if you're minimizing copies of the data, you're minimizing where the data has to be stored and accessed from. So you're thinking about taking up less space, as it were, in data centers. But that's all very well if I'm going to conjecture that. It is interesting to look at a recent study that's come out in the journal Science Direct, Energy and Buildings, where they have shown that the use of decentralized architectures saves between 19 and 28% in energy compared to centralized setups. So there we're gathering evidence here that shows that when you use a distributed way of sharing data, you're actually looking at saving a huge amount of data. So if you think we're doing lots more innovation, we're generating more data, we're looking at the use of AI, which in itself is very energy demand hungry. At data centers, we really need to be thinking about how can we share this data and use it in a way which minimizes the demand for electricity. And this is one of those ways. So I think any innovation in this space is going to be very welcome. On to the next slide. So I just want to quickly share with you a practical experience. So this is the project which I work on, which is in a phase of beta funding. So that's Credo, the climate resilience demonstrator. We're sharing water across energy, water and telecoms assets to be able to understand interdependencies across the infrastructure system, so that we can see when there are extreme weather events in the future, which are the most critical assets across the system which need to be reinforced in preparation for future storms. So where should you put your investment to increase resilience across the system? So in this project, to the next slide, we've been through the process ourselves. This was actually prior to getting SIF funding, but we were working under pressure when we first had funding, and we needed to keep this asset data highly secure, highly confidential. That was part of the conditions of getting on with the innovation in the first phase, was to build trust with the asset owners. Was we needed to have a data license which showed that we would keep the data in a central database at a secure location. So we were able to do that for the first year, but we realised we wouldn't be able to scale Credo to nationwide, from an area in East Anglia to nationwide, if we continued with that approach. So what we've been doing in the next slide is moving from a centralised architecture to a distributed architecture, which will enable us to scale Credo to other parts of the UK and to other sectors. So I just wanted to share with you very quickly there that sort of practical example. We had to go centralised at the very beginning, but over time we're moving towards distributed, and we're looking to make sure that we align with NESO's data sharing infrastructure. So on to the next slide. So lastly, on the next slide, please, so I want to talk about here, how you can use data and AI to minimize energy use. So this is actually an old example from DeepMind. And of course, DeepMind has a lot of data, access to data from Google because they're part of Google, and they use that data from Google. So if you think about Google's data centers, they have, as we're all aware here, servers generate heat, they use a lot of power. The cooling system is fairly complex and dynamic. They have lots of sensors. They used all of that data from the sensors to be able to train neural networks on the data center cooling systems. They then applied machine learning to make recommendations to make these data centers operate more efficiently. So they were able to achieve a 40% reduction in the amount of energy used for cooling, and that was an overall 15% reduction in power usage effectiveness. So this example here is about, it's 8 years old now, but I think it is, this is what's been done in the past. They were able to have access to Google's data. What can we do now? What can we learn from this? How can we sort of move forward from this? So on to the last slide, which is my closing slide, is this is what I want to leave you with, is if we're able, we are going to be increasing our use of data and AI. We're going to be increasing this demand for energy at data centers. We really need to look at how we can share data in a more efficient way, moving over to decentralized architectures for data sharing. We need to look at how AI can reduce energy demand. That's a key area where we need to innovate. But in doing all of this, we need to share our ideas. We need to understand what's been done before. We don't need to sort of repeat what DeepMind have already done. We need to learn from that and move on. And really at the heart of data sharing, it's being collaborative. It's building those relationships across organizations and working on this together. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Some really great pieces of information in there. Good to see Credo highlighted as well. So really, thank you so much for that. And we're going to jump into Jason's talk. And before Jason, you start, just a reminder that the Q&A panel is open here on Teams. So what we'll be doing in the Q&A session is focusing with questions placed in the panel. So not necessarily going into discussions. So please get your questions in and we will tackle those fairly shortly. So over to you, Jason.
Thank you very much. So I just thought it'd be worth introducing myself. So I'm Jason Payne. I work for a company called Marsh, who are a insurance brokerage and professional services firm that has a global remit of 130 countries. For my sins, I am the data center lead within the real estate practice. So I have a lot of insight into what data centers are doing, both in the UK and globally. And in relation to grid and power access, what they're doing when they can't get access to that power. So, for example, if we move on to the next slide, I'll briefly explain as to what Marsh does and how it's structured. So we have 4 different areas of our business. One that's engaged in, as Oliver Wyman, strategic economic consulting. We have a health wealth consulting arm, a reinsurance arm, and Marsh, which is where I operate from, which is an insurance broking and risk management solutions firm. We operate globally, 185,000 colleagues, and have done for a considerable period of time, operating with a number of hyperscalers as well as data center owners. Could we go to the next slide, please? So yeah, this is just kind of showing what we do. Beyond, I guess, what Marsh do and where we're involved, we have recently set up a group of individuals that each have a specialism within their individual parts of the business. So, for example, there'll be a person from energy that has an expertise in data centers and energy, construction, real estate, private equities, mergers and acquisitions. So we have a full gamut across the entire data center industry where we provide advice to our clients. Why is that important? Because it gives us a unique view on the market, where it is, what's going on, and what challenges our clients face within that space. So as an example, there is currently a moratorium on power in Dublin and in Singapore, and we're seeing more regularly two things happening. One, in Dublin, where there is the demand for data centers, but there lacks the power, they're moving to either hydrogenated vegetable oil, so biodiesel, or gas connections in order to satisfy the demand within that market. And because the power that is generated is passed through to the customers, that means that there's no, I suppose, disadvantage to the data center operator by doing that, albeit that most of the operators or tenants within those data centers would much prefer to have an environmentally friendly solution to that. Where we're seeing situations in Singapore where there's no availability of power because they release access to power on a regular basis every sort of 3 years or so, we're seeing data centers moving to locations nearby. So Singapore, in a vicarious way, is actually missing out on those connections by not allowing access to those power grids. So we're seeing that there is this dynamic, innovative approach to data centers where access to power isn't necessarily a deal breaker, albeit it is arguably the single most important feature of any site in the UK. More broadly, we've done a project and analysed what the European market would need to see in order to keep up with the current pace of demand, and we've come across a piece of information from the European Commission that suggested that energy usage would increase by 60% between now and 2030, and would require an investment of £574 billion into the European grid to meet the current data centre demand, or broadly power demand. So there's a massive issue with the availability of power, and as Simon sort of noted, there isn't one cluster within the UK. Part of that is possibly down to the availability of power in different regions, and partly down to different types of data centers and the way that they use their energy. So, for example, if you had a data center that was primarily targeted at financial institutions, typically they're located quite close to infrastructure related to those financial institutions. So whether it be share trading or high frequency trading, they typically will prioritize the latency that you can achieve within those data centers, so that they are very, very fast responding. Whereas if you use regenerative AI, there's not necessarily as much of a demand to be located close to the end user. And we're seeing the emergence of edge data centers, which are designed to be close to the end user, to get around those. And they typically tend to be much smaller than data centers that are in the traditional sense. We're now seeing, in addition to the current demand for power, we're also seeing a exponential increase in the size of data centers. And what that tends to look like is, I suppose, a standard data center will be 60 to 130 megawatts in power. We're seeing that there are planning applications going through at the moment for 1 gigawatt data centers. And certainly it seems to be that within the Middle East, they're looking at 5 gigawatts of new data centers capacity within the near term, and where they have an abundance of solar power, they're also looking at other innovative ways of powering their data centers. One of which might be utilization of hydrogen fuel in some form or another, to be used to balance when the sun's not shining. And the data centers are 24/7, 7 days a week users of power, so it's very difficult to balance grid demand with data centers, which typically might have a hell of a lot of power all the time, and a lot of the time, with the way that these are structured, geographically, big organizations would utilize a data center in different regions, but most, if not all, FTSE 100 companies that would utilize these will have a hub that does a specific purpose. So whether that's point of sale for a petrol sales company, they'll typically have one hub for the whole of Europe, or the whole of the Middle East, or the whole of Asia. And as a result of that, you don't necessarily see fluctuations in demand. And in addition to that, if you have a situation where you have huge amounts of cooling being utilized because it's a particularly hot day and the buildings are using a hell of a lot of cooling capacity, typically you can see spikes in the amount of power that these data centers are using. So that's kind of a very brief run through for what we're seeing more broadly within data centers, and where we're seeing them. And I guess from our perspective in pushing the data center question is to pose some questions. And I suppose one of them would be, should priority be given to areas to create hubs? So if the availability of power is better in regions within the UK, are we asking for those to be given priority where potentially places like London is already at capacity, and more data centers is only going to create further problems, if there is an argument to suggest that potentially data centers don't need to be located close to cities that already have a demand for power? And could data centers sponsor those? If there is a financial requirement for those hubs, could data centers pull together? We've seen the British Volt site be purchased with the intention of creating such a similar hub of data centers in the future, where potentially up to 10 data centers could be built in the same area. The requirement for power and infrastructure there could necessarily lend themselves to becoming a partner within that area and supporting those to avoid moratoriums on power in the future. Beyond that, and beyond sort of what I've mentioned as to what we do at Marsh, I just wondered if it might be appropriate at this point, given the time, to open up to questions and allow for others to ask further questions in relation to what data centers are doing.
Great. Thank you so much, Jason. Really, really helpful talk. Good to see what Marsh is doing as well. And we are about to get into Q&A. So if we can probably have all speakers join us, because it'd be great to get some opinions shared there. We've had, like I said, the Q&A panel open. So if you can, please, if you want a very last minute question snuck in, please do now. We've had a few questions around, I'm turning to you, Joe, because we've had a few questions around how we differentiate some of these innovation issues and challenges around high energy demand centers and how we get that onto the grid from what different entities in the energy space are already doing, like NESO and the sort of planning reform centers. So I don't know if you wanted to comment on some of those questions.
Yeah, and I think it partly answers sort of where we were thinking coming into the webinar and designing it, and also what we wanted out of the webinar of where are the areas for complementarity, where is it that innovation projects and networks are interested in focusing. And we, at the top of the deck of sort of scopes 1 and 2 under the challenge, where we look to sort of frame our ideation activity at the workshop at All Energy going into that, but having more granularity from this is really useful, so that the problem statements we discuss at All Energy are addressing areas of sort of gaps. So those comments are really useful. And I think the connections point on, I think, a couple of Simon's comments about that strand 3 we sort of deprioritized for this immediate ideation activity of focus because of the sort of what's going on and quite a live landscape there. So trying to see where there is complementarity for the SIF. And I suppose the policy question, policy innovation is part of what we're trying to do on the SIF, but we're looking for those relevant strategic transformational projects. So the policy is sort of byproduct and feeding into, say for instance, that scope 3, there's a need for policy expertise in the consortium, but it's not needed across all the strands in this. And I also touched upon our evidence and insights piece of, from the projects we've got, feeding that and the insights back to Ofgem of being responsive, agile, changing policy where it's a blocker. So policy innovation is a sort of byproduct of some of the projects we're funding. But super useful. And I think in the Slido, where there are problem statements coming in that are of high relevance and interest, upvoting those is really helpful, so we can see where we need to be focusing effort in engaging new third parties, and where energy networks are interested in developing consortia, because we have an idea of where we've got gaps in the portfolio, but it's external views as well help us frame and refine that.
Thanks so much, Joe. And sorry to pick on you, Simon. I don't know if you had any other thoughts on that.
on the interest on the interaction between kind of policy change and reform and innovation in this space.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, so I think innovation can absolutely inform kind of questions of policy reform. So sometimes it's about doing the kind of research and analysis to inform some of these things. But sometimes it can be about actually going through the process of coming up with some quite detailed proposals for reform, not necessarily making every decision in an innovation project, but working out some of the questions that need to be explored, even understanding, what would need to change to make something work differently across the landscape. There's a huge number of different regulations and legislation and kind of policy areas that can kind of sometimes restrict innovation. And actually, one thing that would be great to see more from Ofgem is around the kind of future regulatory sandbox and how that might interact with SIF and NIA projects in the future. But I definitely think there's a role, there's a combination to be seen between kind of regulatory policy work and change and innovation. Sometimes it's informative, sometimes it's far more indirect. It's far more direct. And certainly there's definitely a kind of a good track record of where innovation projects have informed some of the more technical areas of kind of regulation in our industry. So yeah, I definitely think that it should be part of the picture and definitely shouldn't be something that's excluded from our thinking in this challenge area. I think there is always a question of, once you start breaking down into potential solutions and challenge areas, making sure, is this really innovation? Is this really what SIF is for? But I don't think we should close off our minds sort of early on in this ideation kind of process.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and it's all about how do we bring in different perspectives in the fold. And you've got 2 thumbs up in that response, so you've clearly said something right. So, on to another question that's come in largely on some of the ancillary services when we're looking at these it's sort of challenge areas. And someone that would combining large loads with storage and grid stability services, and listed out a few of them, such as frequency response on a single connection be in scope. Joe, probably one for you.
I think, and it sounds like it cuts across a couple of the challenges. So without knowing in further detail of specific scopes, I think on first reading, yes, and it probably addresses a couple of the challenges.
Yeah, definitely. And I will recommend that you come to the workshop so we can sort of figure out some of these problems in a bit more detail. Another thumbs up, so I said something right. Tom Andrews has stated, obviously there's a problem that not enough energy available for data centers is, but there's also a big problem with the spiky demand requirements on the hyperscaling data centers. So I don't know if any of the speakers may want to take this one.
Yeah, sure. I certainly think absolutely right. I think hyperscalers, they obviously use a huge amount of power, and their requirements for power is massive, and that doesn't just span the capabilities of what's required within national grid exposures, but also every data center needs to be able to provide its own backup power. So if you have a 100 megawatt data center connection, you need 100 megawatt or more of ancillary backup power to cater for when there isn't anything there. So not only does it create an issue with grid, but more broadly empowering these entities and hyperscaler sized data centers. It wouldn't be unusual to have a big data center have 100 generators that are kind of container sized to be able to generate this stuff. So you need a huge amount of land that goes with that as well. So if you try to put those in central London, that's not always the easiest way to do that. So yeah, we're seeing a lot more innovation around how those are balanced, whether through generally things like battery tech, etc.
Thanks so much, Jason. Sam, quickly, last point.
Yeah, I just wanted to come on one point on the question and one of Jason's points. So one is to say with Tom's kind of question is, it's important to draw the distinction between energy availability and kind of network capacity availability. They're different challenges. And actually, one thing that we see looking forward in the next 5 to 10 years is that a lot of the time, There will be a lot of energy available, not necessarily all of the time, but a lot of the time there will be a lot of energy available. With the growth in wind and solar generation, there will be a lot of energy available a lot of the time, and quite cheaply probably. But not all the time. And data centers, as we've already pointed out, do need to operate all the time, especially all the time, and they've got backups. There's also another interesting question on the how front, I think, about how we connect data centers, is that the way that data centers done things in the past with their own backups makes absolute sense for your kind of 20, 25 megawatt data center connected to a distribution substation. It is possible. It's not necessarily cheap, but it is possible to achieve much higher levels of resilience with transmission connections, which would bring into the question the I should say this, that you could potentially economically trade against the kind of backup requirements and reliability and resilience. And I don't think that's necessarily an area that's really been explored yet in this space, with the move to scaling up data centers and kind of achieving that transmission kind of power level redundancy. Like when we've got a city that's 300, 400 megawatts, we don't build 400 megawatts worth of diesel generators in case the transmission system supplying it fails.
Yeah. Thanks, Simon. I think you gave us a movie title for if energy networks had one there. We'll have a lot of energy, but not all of the time. Sarah, you had a point on this.
Yeah, if I may. So it's not just about how do we supply the ever increasing demand of data centers, but it's how do we make the data and the AI more energy efficient. Yeah. And that's where I think we need more innovative approaches.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks so much, everyone. And so I think I do have one last question to sneak in. 1 second while it loads. On hyper data centers, it might be cheaper to build your own power station than get a grid connection, and that definitely is coming through. It's a good segue eventually. Thanks, Simon, for our conversation on the Slido, because we are seeing some problem statements coming in. You know, we see Google and Amazon and Microsoft also building their own sort of private connections and powering that up. So we can touch on that definitely when I get to that slide. I'm just going to hand back, let the speakers off the hook. Thank them so much for all of their time. I know very much you get a lot of these requests, so thank you so much for being here today. And Joe, I'll pass right back to you for the forward outlook before I sneak back in again.
Awesome, thank you very much. There's also one question for Jason on small modular reactors in the Q&A. I don't know if you can get a typed response to that one. I can get a chance to pick up there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think small modular reactors are the absolute holy grail for powering data centers, mainly because it removes it provides an infinite amount of power potentially from a resilience perspective. I can't see that happening within the next 10 years, owing to things like insurance requirements and also regulation. Even with some of the very interesting developments in this area, I think it's going to be something that's going to be a bit of a track further down the line. With things like abundance of energy that's produced environmentally friendly, and potentially too much of that, I personally think you'd be more likely to see hydrogen being used within fuel cells as backup systems rather than SMRs.
Awesome, thanks, Ray. I just wanted to squeeze that last one in there. Awesome. So that just closed the Q&A and expert speaker panel. On the slide here, you can see highlighted our plans for upcoming webinars and then follow-up workshops for some of the other challenges under the round 5, 7 challenges that we've got. We've got 5 challenges that we're focusing on between now and September. This is the first one in that series. We've got a follow-up workshop on this challenge happening at All Energy in Glasgow on the 14th of May. More details on that in the next couple of slides. We've got a webinar on consumer-centric grid expansion happening next Thursday, same time next week, with a follow-up workshop at Utility Week Live in Birmingham. Then I see there's quite a bit of interest in Challenge 1, superconducting, particularly in the Slido when I've been having a look. So we've got a webinar on the 5th of June on that challenge, with a follow-up online workshop on the 18th of June. With then after summer, we've got a bit of a break over summer. So we've got Green Gas Challenge 6 and Challenge 7 whole system optimization plans, which are to be in September. Dates we'll be confirming those in the next couple of months with details on registering for those. Next slide, please. Just then a bit of a sort of discussion summary of going from webinar into the workshop at All Energy in a couple of weeks' time. So some of the key things we wanted, we've been getting some great discussion about areas of priority, where there's areas of interest under the challenge, and we wanted this webinar to serve as a sort of state of the challenge, what's some of the key understanding of what's gone before, where is the current activity, and start having a discussion about where are the areas of interest and priority for developing consortia. Bring together stakeholders. See, there's been some introing in the Slido as well. Clarify some objectives of the challenge, and equip attendees with some resources to help go into ideation. So we've got further context on international case studies, other initiatives that'll be sent out as follow-up from this, and then translating that into the workshop where we can target those problem statements that are of real relevance and importance, and hopefully form new partnerships and consortia for proposals and deepen understanding off the back of this webinar and identify high potential projects moving forward. Next slide.
Great. Thanks so much, Joe. So just coming back to the problem statements, again, what we're trying to get here is really understand what are some of the key issues that we're facing. What are the main pain points that we should really be focusing on, particularly in the workshop and further ideation beyond. So when we're looking at problem statements, we want really specific, concise statements that really identify a particular challenge within the overall challenge theme. So if you're looking for sort of examples, feel free to pop over to Slido. There are a lot there. I think we currently have 27 or 28. We're seeing a few there being brought up on HVDC, decentralization, SMR, private connections, a lot, which is really great to see. The focus areas, just on before we move on, the last two focus areas are really what we're looking for. So the risk of stranded capacity and forecasting and how we improve those, as well as how do we optimize the connection. And we heard some really good points from the speakers there. And it's not just about the connection, it's also about what you're connecting. So on the next slide, we're just going to highlight that we have, as Joe mentioned, those workshop coming up on the 14th. So if you're going to be at All Energy, we'll be there. If you haven't booked and you want to go, we'll be there. And these are on the right, you can see the sessions that are of most of interest. The workshop will be at 11 a.m. and that's where we're really going to hash out some of these things. And the next webinar in the series, and then one point that I've seen with some of the questions is that the webinar order doesn't necessarily follow the challenge order. So if you haven't seen challenge 1 or something else come up yet, it's not that you've missed anything. This is the first webinar and we're just pairing things with certain events and activities that are happening. The challenges don't happen chronologically. So we'll be having another webinar on how to deliver grid expansion. Pop out your phone at this present moment. If you're still on, scan that QR code. It will take you directly to the Eventbrite page where you can sign up. That's also at 11. We're keeping these consistently 11 a.m. on a Thursday, and you can join us for that discussion as well. I think I'm coming back to you, Joe, just for final closing remarks on the SIF program. Next slide, please.
Awesome. Thanks, Masai. So I mentioned earlier about additional ways to engage with the SIF, understand projects that we funded, get in touch with us, and some other resources. So we have the Ofgem SIF website. We also have the Innovate UK the Innovate UK SIF website. Links are in the slide deck here. We've got a newsletter, which is the best place to keep in touch and hear about our latest events that are upcoming. We have our annual reports that we publish. 2024 came out earlier this year. And I also flagged the project directory. So this is linked in the slide here, but this is where 3 times a year we'll be refreshing this with a live picture of what the SIF has funded all the way back to 2021 and our round 1 challenges. So you can understand who's been involved in projects, how much funding they've got, where they're at, and is a great resource to see, what is in the SIF portfolio of those over 240 projects. And there's also a couple of comments about those with ideas and engaging with us. So in the bottom right, there's a QR code for our expression of interest. So if you've got an idea or you've got expertise against the round 5 challenges or want to engage with the SIF team to discuss those, you can scan that QR code and give us a bit of detail about what you're thinking. And you can also request our innovation surgeries. So that's one-to-one support with a member of the SIF team to discuss the idea further, refine thinking on it, and get support from us. So that's the best place if you've got an idea or expertise that you think are relevant and want further sort of clarification and engagement with us. You can scan that QR code. That's also relevant for those challenges. So we only had 5 of the challenges in the slide earlier of the 7. So that's not to say that the other 2 challenges that we don't have a webinar and workshop on aren't in focus. They definitely are. We just are focusing on those 5 between now and September. If you've got interest in the other 2 challenges, the expression of interest, we can also engage. It's across all 7 challenges. So if you're an innovator, third party, interested in taking part, do complete that. And more broadly, our sif_ofgem@iuk.ukri.org email, you can get in touch with any other queries. I think that's the last thing from me.
Great. Thanks so much. No, bang on time. So thank you everyone for joining us today. We're going to keep the Slido on for the next 24 hours. So you've got lots of time. We also have a feedback survey on how this webinar has gone. So you can again pull out your phone or click when eventually you need to submit some feedback and give us on this. Thank you to all the speakers for coming out today. Thank you for all the participants. I know you're also giving a lot of your time to learn more about where we have challenges in this space. What do we need innovation on? What are some of the gaps? There's a long road ahead, and there are many opportunities to get in touch with the SIF team. And if you need some connection and help and support with that, the Carbon Trust will be happily able to connect you there. So until then, until the next workshop and webinar, thank you so very much and have a great day. Bye, everyone.
Thank you very much, everyone.